Hi, folks. Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and today I'm doing yet another installment in the Freelancer Q&A series that I do. And as a special treat that I'm hoping you can't hear, my cat and toddler are both quite loud outside. I can hear it, but I'm told that my mic actually does a pretty good job of filtering that out. So I will apologize in advance if you hear toddler/cat noises on this live stream. At any rate, the question that I'm fielding today came up in discussion in the Hit Subscribe Circle community. And that is basically, should you unbundle strategy work from labor? So in response to a video, I think it was the last one I did, I'll throw up a link on YouTube when this goes up there, but there was this kind of follow-up question about what is my take on unbundling, let's call it strategy work from labor work in services. And so this is as it pertains to a freelancer is the context of this question. So actually, let me just read it here. The verbatim is, do you have any thoughts on unbundling the thinking work, parenthetically, strategy, road mapping, solution architecture, from the doing work, in parentheses, coding, technical SEO, design, etc., and how the selling of these things differs? As an example, would you price the thinking work higher than the doing work because it's more valuable, or would you do the opposite to avoid being asked to do implementation? Maybe you would subcontract the doing work. So that's the full question as it was asked to me. The part about subcontracting, that is or that is kind of speaking to what I would suggest doing. But let me address this philosophically. So for me, the question, should you unbundle strategy and labor, I'll call it. And by labor, there are some good examples in the question itself. But so strategy is consulting. Doing strategy work is when you have clients that are essentially paying you to tell them what to do. That's what I think of as strategy. It's being paid for advice, for your brain and for your understanding of what they should do in their situation. So that's the strategy piece. And then labor is doing things like, as mentioned in the question, writing code or doing technical SEO or, making a logo or what have you. So the question really here is, can you as a freelancer do both of those things for the same client? And generally, or, and if you can, should you, I might have put the cart before the horse there. My opinion is no, not really. You can't do both sets of those things meaningfully for the same client. And I would generally say that if you're an indie, you're a freelancer, you shouldn't do both of those things in general. So the question isn't so much from my perspective whether you should unbundle those or not. The answer to that, in my opinion, is yes, but I would go so far as to say you can't help but unbundle them. And so here's what I mean. When you go and you say, I'm going to sell you architecture and I'm also going to sell you programming, let's say, to the client, they're not going to make a distinction. They're not going to say like, oh, well, you're doing this project and at times your work is more valuable. So here you're doing some really strategic stuff. So yeah, I'm going to pay more for that. And then now you're doing less strategic stuff that seems not as valuable. So I'm going to pay you a reduced rate for that. That's going to be really weird with clients in general. They're probably not going to agree to that. So, I mean, just put yourself in this position and imagine that you had a service provider of some kind come over. Maybe it was somebody to like clean up. This is on my mind because we need to have this done. But like, there's all kinds of leaves all over the place, to do a fall cleanup, like get rid of all the leaves and that type of stuff. So imagine that probably the way this would go is somebody would come over and take a look at your yard. I mean, this is what happens to us, and say, okay, for a property of about that size, I'm going to charge you $300 for this service. Or they might say like, well, I come over and I do yard keeping work at $30 an hour. What they're probably not going to do, and if they did, you as the consumer would probably look at them strangely, is to say like, okay, well, first I have to come over and strategize about how to clean up your yard, and then I have to do that. And while I'm strategizing, that's actually worth $50 an hour. While I'm doing it, it's worth $30 an hour. You would probably have any number of different thoughts, but like one, the most cynical might be something like, what is there to strategize about? Just clean up my yard. I'm paying you $30 an hour. Yeah, I get that you're going to tell me there's some strategy involved. I don't really believe you. And most of your work is going to be done at $30 an hour. Just do it at that rate. Or, I mean, maybe they would expect some kind of blended rate, but that would seem really strange. Like, I'm going to do something strategic for a little while, then I'm also going to do something unstrategic, and I want two different rates for those things. So, from a pragmatic perspective in the B2B world, like if you're saying to your clients, I do architecture and then I do coding and I'm going to charge you different rates, the client, in the most sympathetic sense to you would probably say like, look, just quote me some kind of blended rate. Like, I don't care what mode you're in and how valuable you feel you are. I just want to know what this is going to cost me. Now, if you're doing both strategy and labor as part of the engagement, the client is quite likely going to view that just as labor. Um, Strategy done right is usually worth orders of magnitude potentially more than labor is. And the reason for that is that labor tends to be more of a commodity. Strategy usually comes along with like a differentiator. So, for instance, if I went back into consulting and maybe I knew how to come into organizations and size up their sales process and their revenue operations, rev ops, if I knew how to go and take a look at those things, and generally with the right kind of business that I was familiar with, I could make their sales process less expensive and more efficient, but also increase the volume of their sales dramatically. And I could repeatably do this at clients. This wouldn't be labor. I wouldn't actually be doing the work of being a salesperson or setting up their CRM. Instead, I would be coming in and spending a week or two and giving them a series of things that they could go execute on their own that would dramatically increase the profitability of their business. My knowledge of how to do that is worth a lot of money. It's worth a lot of money to them than if I stuck around and actually executed the configuration of their CRM. So now think of things that way. Strategy is generally, if you're good at it, way more valuable than labor is. Um, so there is a general sense of that in the broader B2B world. This is typically true. And also there is this sense of strategy orienting around the upper levels of the org chart. So you think of what executives do as strategy. If you are offering strategy services, you're typically engaged with executives. It's typically people with buying capability that bring you in to tell them what to do. So if you are mirroring their org chart with how you come in, when you're doing strategy, you're being engaged by executives. When you're doing labor, you're being engaged typically at a lower level of the org chart. So people understand that, even if not consciously, that the McKinsey style of consultant is probably dealing with the executives. The WordPress engineer is probably dealing with a line manager or other engineers. So there is this sense in the world like that the strategy labor is going to be on average more valuable. The strategy labor, that's not what I meant. The strategy work is going to be on average more valuable. You're going to have a sponsor that sits in the C-suite typically with that kind of thing. And it is going to be very short and intense in nature and high stakes and all that. So that's how the general corporate world thinks of strategy versus labor is going to be lower stakes, longer duration, engaged at a lower level of the org chart. So trying to sell both of those things is going to be weird, and it's often going to not be well received. If you are selling both strategy and labor, I would say that you're really just selling labor and probably offering unsolicited advice that people don't care about. So I hope all of that makes it sort of clear why I'm saying you can't really do both of these things as the same person. It just doesn't tend to work. Either they view you as a laborer or they view you as a strategist. And if you do both and you come in as a strategist, and then you start doing labor, you will actually slide down the org chart. I have seen this in person actually on a number of occasions. There's one thing in particular I'm remembering I was doing 7-8 years ago. I was brought into a government context, there was a government organization in the state of Michigan, and I was doing subcontracting work for a consulting firm that a newly hired CIO in this government organization had just been hired, and they wanted an assessment. They were years behind schedule and way over budget with this piece of software. They hadn't even managed to get into an alpha state. So the charter was really, do we cut bait here? Do we evolve this thing? Do we push forward? Like, what do we do? New CIO has taken over this boondoggle and wanted to know what should happen next. So I came in along with a couple of people that were managing director-ish people at that level of the org chart. So high-end consulting to help this government agency decide what to do next. So we did that. We made our recommendations, and part of the follow-on recommendations were restructuring their org chart, getting different about how they hired, getting different about how they wrote code, and a lot of other things that I won't go into too much detail about. But I stayed on for the second phase of that engagement in a management consulting capacity. And the interesting thing was the consulting organization's principals backed out. They weren't quite as involved. I was still there helping them set up the org chart, but they started to bring in other people that were more at the practitioner level. And one of those, in my humble opinion, was miscast in a strategy consulting type of role. And this person was a firm kind of TDD practitioner adherent, do all the processes, do them hard, do them by the letter. And so this person started to insist that the program CIO and myself and a few other principals start to have a daily or weekly stand-up. I don't know. It was, because they were executing the whole agile thing. And it did not take long. I would give it maybe 3 or 4 weeks before the CIO, the program CIO, said, I'm not really sure I'm so valuable in this meeting. Why don't you have this person reporting into me attend it instead? And then that person also handed it off. So I watched in real time as somebody behaving like a laborer and executing this type of thing managed to slam the relationship down the org chart in like an amount of time that you wouldn't believe. So the point of this story is really that when you are doing both strategy and labor, however valuably you might be doing the strategy, you/the organization that's being represented here, if you're doing labor, you will be viewed as an individual contributor. You will be viewed as labor, and you will slide down the org chart. It is borderline inevitable. So I hope that makes my position clear and why I'm saying these two things are really hard to pull off. If you wanted to in a freelance practice, you could have some strategy clients that you just wait in and advise them on software architecture, and then maybe have some labor clients if you wanted to be writing code that you did that with and for. And I think you could pull that off. That's a reasonable thing to do. But there is nobody for whom you're going to write a bunch of code that will really view you as strategic. Anything you're doing that individual contributors do in the organization, they are going to tend not to view as strategic. Even if it is, even if you know your stuff, it's really hard to be viewed that way. So if you are a solo operator, this is my recommendation when it comes to the strategy/labor conundrum, because it's different. And I'll get into how you unbundle as a business. You have more options. But if you are just one person, my recommendation would be to pick one and do it. You really can't do both. So if you really like writing code, or you really like, doing whatever technician style work that you're doing, then do it. I mean, you can make a really nice living as a freelancer writing code. I imagine you could charge $150 an hour on the open market. That is not a bad living at all. If you like that, you like flow state, I would go for it. To be perfectly honest, I tend to like the feeling of writing code myself and being productive in that fashion more than strategy consulting. Don't get me wrong, it's fun to give advice. I like being a management consultant, but there is something that's really hard to beat about, sitting at your computer and being productive and building a thing. And I miss those days. There is nothing wrong with it. That said, personally, if I were back to a free agent operator, I would still do strategy. It's way more lucrative. You can easily get to a situation where you're making, a few $100,000 a year in profit and not having to work steadily. You could do something where you had like 2-week strategy engagements for 25 to 50K ish. And I mean, how many of those would you need to do a year? If you were getting to the top end of that, you could execute 6 of those a year. So maybe you do one a month, and then you are building out some kind of R&D property or whatever in the rest of your time. So your options and your compensation and your leverage are just so much less bounded if you're doing strategy work, because it's way higher paying, it's way higher leverage, it's way better for your network, you're going to be engaged with executives, et cetera. So I personally would unbundle them and only do the strategy piece. That would be my approach. And in fact, my whole goal in life is to build up enough equity and investment that I don't need to depend on any kind of labor or strategy income in order to live. And then I would probably go back to doing labor just to build stuff that I felt like building. So anyway, that would be my recommendation. Now, if you are a freelancer and you want to go the route that I'm going, I mean, I guess I could go into how you would unbundle them and only do labor, but I don't think that's a particularly hard to solve problem. If you want to get into only doing the strategy piece with unbundling them, the recommendation that I would make is to start trying to land pure strategy engagements. This can be easy to do via standing up some kind of productized service, some sort of roadmap or deliverable, or some kind of advice call or retainer, something that's well scoped, not overly expensive, but is just purely you giving advice. So if you build something like that and try to market it, that's one way to start out, and trying to get some clients into your funnel doing that. Now, once you start getting strategy gigs, you'll try to shift the balance of your book of business more and more into that strategy piece until eventually it's all there. Now, what's going to happen when you are engaged as a strategist is you are going to be asked to do labor. You're not exactly, I mean, if you come in and you say, look, I'm going to give some consulting advice here and tell you what to do, it's not that they're going to say, okay, now I want you to turn around and do it, but it's a very logical thing. If you tell a client, okay, here's what you need to be successful, you need to do A, B, C, and D. For them to say, okay, I think I understand A and B. I have no idea how to do C. Can you tell me what to do next? So it's easy enough for them to get into asking you, how do I go about doing it? What's the next step? And then from there to say something like, will you manage it or run it? Now, this is the point at which your muscle memory as a laborer might kick in and you'll say, oh, I'll just do it. That's where you've got to stop. You have to say, I can run this for you. We'll bring in some subcontractors, or I know some firms. So if you think the situation is going to become relevant, you should, when you're making strategic recommendations, understand exactly how you would commission and preside over your recommendations. So if your recommendation is for them to build out some kind of mobile app that would take, a couple of people 3 months, then you should have those people in mind. So do you have some buddies that could do it? Do you know a consulting firm or a contracting type firm that would do it? Do you have some people in your Rolodex? Would you help them hire full-time employees to do it? So whatever recommendation you're making, you should have a staffing plan in mind for it. And then you could offer to subcontract out the work. You could offer to do referrals, whatever the case may be. But whatever it is, there is a moment where you're making strategic recommendations, and the idea of you presiding over / doing / whatever the labor comes up, you need to have a plan for running it, not doing it, whether it's subcontracting, referrals, hiring a vendor on their behalf, etc. So you need to make sure that the only relationship you have with labor, with service labor, is that you are managing it or overseeing it, not that you're doing it. I guess I'll round out this topic with, like, let's say that you start to grow as a business. What does this unbundling look like? Now, Hit Subscribe does this, for instance. We do strategy work and we do labor work. And you can do both of those things as a business, as a services business. Now, be careful because there's all manner of conflicts of interest that can come up. Like, if I were running, you say, take that government entity that I had been subcontracting for. Part of the reason that made such a good fit was that I didn't really have a horse in the race myself. So bringing in subcontractors to make recommendations about what to do next is a good way to defray conflict of interest. You don't want to be doing strategy and then say, my strategic recommendation is that you pay the fulfillment arm of my business to do a bunch of stuff. So you have to be careful about managing conflicts of interest. And in general, in a business that's doing services, if you're going to do both strategy and labor, you need to segment that in some way. The easiest thing to do there is to have different roles for that. So for instance, I, through Hit Subscribe, will sometimes do fractional CMO work. That's something that's been coming up this year. I will help clients design and build content programs, but I don't write the content. There are things that I do in a strategic role that I don't do in a deliverable role. So you can have some people that are doing, you'll see this a lot in like custom app dev firms. You know, they might have a role that's like a account executive or delivery executive or managing director. Like there are people that will do consulting work that don't do hands work. And then there will be the, I mean, they'll call them consultants, but there will be the contractors that are doing the app dev. So having different people or different roles for strategy and fulfillment is one good way to do it. You would certainly price and scope that work differently as a business. And then one last thing that I'll mention is you can have whole different departments or even brands. So there might be a strategy department and there might be a fulfillment department, and you build in a bit of a firewall there. So the strategy department almost is insulated from worrying about conflicts and recommending the fulfillment department. Like, hey, we've done this strategy engagement. I can give you, so-and-so's number over in our fulfillment. You could talk to them. You could talk to other people. You could even go so far as to have different brands. So, think like Toyota and Lexus or something. You could actually have different brand names for your strategy and your fulfillment arms. So there are different ways to structure this as a business. This in the beginning would be overkill, but you could find yourself there faster than you think. If you start to transition into doing pure strategy work, like you're creating architectures or making recommendations to businesses, and they start to ask you for fulfillment, and you say, well, I don't do this, but I've got a couple of, colleagues that can do this. I'll recommend them to you. You might go into that thinking that you'll just hand them, Susie Smith's number and they'll work with her. They might instead come to you and say, well, can we just run it on your paper? Can you subcontract Susie Smith? Now, before you know it, you're taking on subcontractors, you're sending 1099s, you're doing this type of work. Once you're starting to do that, it isn't the biggest jump in the world to making an employee hire. And so before you know it, you've kind of backed into this small agency. You've got employers, you've got employees and subcontractors. That can happen pretty quickly. And once that starts to happen, that's when you're in this, okay, how do we segment the strategy and the fulfillment piece here? So that's probably a lot. This is a subject in which I have a lot of experience from a lot of different angles, so it's easy for me to kind of talk about this at length, and I certainly have strong opinions. I imagine there are people out there that are going to say I'm dead wrong and maybe even cite counterexamples of where they charge a bunch of money to lay out a software architecture and then charge less money on a normalized time basis to go fulfill it, and they've earned a living doing this. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying that in my travels, what I've seen over and over again is that people, especially in leadership, will tend to view strategy folks and fulfillment folks differently. I'm saying you will be walking uphill, swimming upstream, whatever you want to call it, if you're going to try to be both of those things to the same person at the same time. I have seen lots and lots and lots of examples of people enter at the strategy level and slide down the org chart by doing fulfillment. I have seen lots and lots of examples of people mistaking themselves for consultants when they're contractors and going in and taking that charter and spewing unsolicited advice that nobody listens to. I have seen a lot of counter examples of strategy and fulfillment living in the same person. I have seen very, very, very few examples of this being done successfully. So few that, number one, it's hard to remember them, and then number two, I can kind of without reservation say I would not try to sell both of these things if you are a solo operator. So hopefully that's helpful or somewhat informative or interesting or controversial. I don't know, whatever. Hopefully those of you watching got something out of it. That was one of the weaker conclusions I've done. So anyway, I'm gonna quit while I'm not that far behind and say that I will catch you all next time.